I never do these kinds of videos, but last night I had a dream and I need to share it with you. Now, before I tell you about the dream, I don't dream. And if I do, I never remember them. I haven't maybe had a dream in 20 years since I was in my 30s. So, and I'm past my 50s. So I just wanted to let you know that this dream that I had last night was very vivid. I remember I was driving and it was dusk. The last of the sunlight was still shining in the sky. So it wasn't, the street lights weren't on yet, but it was just that little bit of sunlight left. And I remember the street light flickering on, which caught my attention. And I saw there was stars, so many stars, millions of stars, and it was just odd. I found it really strange that there was stars in the sky, considering that there was still light. Usually you have to be in a really dark area to see the stars the way I saw them. But when that street light flickered on, I looked at it, and then I started to notice like one star moving, then 2, then 10, and then they all just started just slowly descending down. I slammed my brakes and I flipped around, and as I was driving back down the street, I was trying to rush back home. There were cars pulling over and people getting out, and I just weaved through traffic. I didn't care. I just weaved through traffic. People were getting out and looking up at the sky as the stars slowly started to descend. It wasn't just shooting stars. They were slowly descending down. As I pulled into my neighborhood, I noticed people coming out of their houses and looking up. And I just drove right up into my front yard, and just slammed my brakes. I didn't care about any of that. I saw people recording, and I started to yell at them to go back in their houses and pray. It was vivid. I was there. It was real. It wasn't how you would expect it to be in a regular black and white dream. I remember then, as I looked up and people started looking up, they started to come down faster and zigzag in different areas. And then I started yelling at people, and then in the distance there was like explosions, and then you just heard a faint distance of explosions and screams. And I started yelling at people to come into my house, and people just started coming in my house. We were huddled in the living room, and I told them, close your eyes and pray. Don't open your eyes. I don't care what you hear. Don't stop praying. There was about 20 of us huddled there, and we were just praying. And I prayed to Christ for protection, and I prayed the blood of the Lamb over each and every single one of us, and over my home, to protect us from all this. And in the background, you could hear people screaming, and then their screams would just stop, and you could hear explosions and gunshots going off, and then the ground started trembling. I could feel the trembling, and I was just praying. I kept praying, and I kept praying, and you could hear things falling from shelves, and glass breaking, and explosions and screams. I mean, it was that, and I just kept praying, and I was praying so loudly and with such intensity, and that I could feel heat emanating from my body. I wasn't perspiring. I was just, this heat just come over me, and I just remember praying. And I didn't stop. It didn't seem very long, maybe about an hour or so, when I started to realize that the sounds outside, it stopped shaking. The sounds outside, you couldn't hear anybody anymore. There was no more explosions happening. And as I slowly peeked and opened my eyes, it was daylight. I remember when this started, it was dusk, It was now daylight, so, but it only seemed like an hour. I went to the front door and I walked outside. There were cars that had looked like they had been burning for hours, but they were just hot. You could see the smoke coming off of burnt cars, and some cars were just sitting there with their doors open, empty. Some houses were on fire, some houses were caved in, some houses were standing upright, like mine. But what I saw were bodies in fetal positions on the streets and on yards and in the neighborhood, and they were in their fetal positions, but they were burned. They were whole, but they were just burned. I remember when I first walked outside, the smell of the smoke and sulfur. I smelled sulfur. You could hear the crackling of the fires burning here and there in the distance. That's what it saw. All you heard was that, and it was quiet other than those things. I woke up and I fell back to sleep, and somehow I ended up back in my dream. But I wasn't in the neighborhood anymore. It was a group of us, maybe 10 people. We were armed. Some had rifles. I was carrying a baseball bat. People had wagons behind them with like food and water, gear, survival gear in these things. There was no power. The cars, you couldn't get them started. We could only walk. But we weren't in the neighborhood. Like I said, we were in the city. I don't know what city, but we were in the city, and we were walking, and we were alert, on high alert, because though there was other people who had survived, but they either didn't pray to God for protection, and were hidden enough from God's wrath that they didn't get burned. But they weren't necessarily alive. I really, from what I gathered was that they were alive. They looked like they were bruised, but they weren't bruised. It was how the body looks as it's starting to decompose. They smelled of rotten flesh and sulfur, but they weren't alive. They were possessed by demons. So it was like they weren't, if they saw us, they wanted to attack us. They didn't, and there's a TV show, The Walking Dead. I've never watched that. I never wanted to, because that right there was very frightening, the sounds they made. This wasn't like that. They didn't walk slowly or make those sounds. They were animated. They could run after you. And they didn't want our food and water. They just wanted to kill us or take over us. So we were on guard. People had rifles, and I had baseball bats. We were ready. I remember we were in a building that hadn't had a lot of damage from the earthquakes. And we were walking up the stairway, like a stairwell inside a building that just, you go up to a landing and you just keep going up. We were going up. And I remember hearing something, and I told people to stop. I just put my hand up and everybody stopped. And I peeked into the middle of the stairway and looked up. And when I looked up, what was looking down were these people, these dead people, but animated and alive because they were taken over by demons. Looking down, it was just like, oh my God. And I woke up, and I woke immediately up. I didn't go back to sleep, and I wrote all this down. I'm sharing this with you because, like I said, I don't ever have dreams, and not since my 30s.